Good morning. First, I want to say how much I've been enjoying the conference. I've been enjoying the other talks here and in getting a chance to meet a bunch of you and have interesting conversations, and I certainly hope that we'll do that after my presentation today. So, my name is Cheryl Strauss Einhorn, and today I'm going to talk to you about my decision-making system that I call the AREA method. I'm going to begin with a short story. I'm going to explain what the AREA method is, what my work was with the State Department to help a group of foreign counterterrorism professionals, and then I'm going to take you through a brief case study that I did with them of how AREA was used by a non-governmental organization, a charity, to broker trust between its local community and the government of Nepal after the devastating earthquake there a few years ago. I'm going to close with a few testimonials of the impact of the AREA workshop on the counterterror group and let you know how one of the counterterror experts is using the system now. First, my story. One day when I was a young girl, my mother went out and got her makeup done at a makeup counter. And when she returned, she asked my father, "How do I look?" And he said, "Dear, when I see you, I see my fantasy, not the makeup that you're wearing." She got angry. Did this mean that he didn't really see her? Even as a little girl, I knew it meant he saw her perfectly. And what it illustrates is what you see on this slide, that we don't see things as they are, but we see them as we are. And that means that we assign feeling and meaning to our interactions that may make our interpretation of events not only incorrect, but it may mean that we can be in a moment with somebody, a big or a small moment, or even over time where we have a series of interactions, and although we're together, it may mean that we're having totally different experiences. Now, it's one thing when my mom wants to look and feel pretty, but it can be downright dangerous when we're sizing up a situation where being on the same page and really connecting with someone is critical, when the conversation is urgent and the outcome may make or break trust and impact the well-being of our communities and even of our country. So this raises two questions, which is, how can we try to share a similar experience with someone else, other stakeholders, so that we see things in a shared way? And how can we question respectfully when we don't, so that we can build trust with the other stakeholders when making decisions? So this question was put to me by an official at the State Department when she invited me to speak to this group of foreign counterterror experts from around the world. And she came to me after having read my book. She felt that my AREA decision-making system, which is laid out in the book, fit the state's program needs because of its emphasis on understanding other perspectives and managing for our own cognitive bias. Now, I wasn't sure how my decision-making system would apply in counterterror situations until I asked her for the State Department's program goal. And so you can see it up on the screen, to explore the underlying conditions that promote extremism, such as social structures and economic disparity, and to look for community-based efforts to create safe spaces, resist violence, the emergence of isolation, and extremism. And then I got it, because here's a brief description of AREA. It's an acronym for the steps of my perspective-taking decision-making system that controls for bias, focuses on the incentives of others, and works to expand our knowledge while improving our judgment. So why perspective-taking? Perspective-taking gives you a beautiful two-for-one. By walking in the footsteps of other people, you not only better understand their incentives and motives, but you gain distance on yourself, your own thoughts and feelings, and that can enable you to better spot, control for, and counteract your cognitive biases. So I'm going to show you two visual maps right now of the AREA method. This one shows you how the process fits all together and works as a feedback loop, because not all investigations are linear, nor should they be. At times you need to be driven back and to part all of the process. And then the next slide is going to show you some sample steps. But what I want you to take away here is that what AREA works to do is to move your work from bias to objectivity. It recognizes that all information is tainted by where it comes from. We have incentives that motivate our behavior and our facts. So if we separate out our sources of information and look at them one at a time, we can better evaluate them. It's the opposite of Googling something, where immediately you're getting all perspectives at once, which makes it impossible at times to tease out incentives, but also to build your own truth meter. And so the letters of AREA stand for Absolute, Relative, Exploration, and Exploitation as Analysis. As you see, the first absolute phase refers to primary uninfluenced information at the center of the research and decision-making process. So say you're making a decision about funding an opportunity. Say, for instance, it's the World Bank. In that case, the World Bank would be your target, and you might consider, well, how have they done in the past? What's their return on investment? How do they even calculate that return on investment for the bank? And do you agree with what they fund? The R, or relative, the next concentric circle of information. That's secondary information or tertiary information. It's somehow related to the target of the decision, but not from the target itself. Here, for that same example on funding the World Bank, for instance, your relative sources could be watchdog groups that monitor the bank spending, academic reports, and maybe a review of how were decisions made in the past to fund the bank and at what level. The E's in AREA are exploration and exploitation. I refer to them as the twin engines of creativity. They're both about getting beyond document-based sources to upgrade your research with creative exercises. Exploration is fundamentally about identifying good sources and asking them great questions, so it teaches you how to interview. And then exploitation turns its lens inward on yourself as a decision maker to help you think about how you may consider how your assumptions stack up against your evidence. And then the final A analysis synthesizes the perspectives, processing and interpreting the information you've collected, and it helps you to come to conviction. The result, as you'll see from the example that I'm going to take you through, is that AREA inherently marries together the social performance side of human behavior, our thinking flaws, with the data and analytics of decision making, so that you're solving your problems holistically and with a collaborative backbone. We don't operate in a vacuum, and yet we do tend to make decisions alone. But to truly solve our problems and innovate, we do need to focus on the incentives and motives of others so that we can strengthen our relationships and give our decisions a better, a bought-in, a holistic chance at success. For all of you here in this room, whether you're representing a company, a nonprofit, or a government, you don't want to be thought of as a flawed thinker, and you certainly don't want to approach other parties as if they are. So what AREA can offer you is a step-by-step system for how to get together and partner to identify and confront preconceived notions so that you can foster trust. So here's the second visual map and some of the sample steps of AREA. And what I want you to see here is that we traditionally think of innovation as something like the Tesla or the iPhone, but certainly processes can be innovative as well. Just think of Louis Pasteur developing pasteurization, or if you go way back, you can think of Pythagoras and the theorem that relates to how we think about AREA. Now, I'm certainly not saying that my AREA method is in those categories, but what I am offering you is the opportunity to update the fact that we all need the opportunity to engage with a thinking system that understands that we are flawed thinkers, laden with biases. And the fix that AREA proposes is to change how we fundamentally interact with our information and with the other people involved in our decision so that we can wash away some of that distortion that we've caked on over time and that dramatically changes the risk of making a poor decision. So here you can just see that AREA moves your work from one vantage point to the next, isolating and categorizing your information based upon the source. And it also gives you that opportunity much more easily, therefore, to vet the information that you're collecting from earlier sources. And this combined check on yourself and focus on others is what helps to create that safer space for coming together to solve problems holistically. Just one other thing about AREA is that one of the most vexing parts of complex problem solving is how do you get started, right? For many people, that's frustrating. Where do you look for information, and how do you begin that actual process? And so AREA says, don't worry about that. Instead, invert the problem and ask yourself what I consider a far more empowering question, which is, what constitutes success for your organization or for yourself specifically. Now, even without knowing how you're going to solve your problem, you likely do know what needs to happen in the outcome of that decision for you to know that it has succeeded for you personally. From there, you can derive what I call your critical concepts, the 1, 2, or 3 things that need to happen in the outcome to reach that vision of success, and now you're no longer in an open-ended problem. Instead, you're ready for something that is targeted and focused on that vision of success. So what happened with the counter-terror group? Well, we sat and discussed what kind of decisions they were facing and the threats that the representative countries were struggling with. And although they faced very diverse extremist groups, Maoists in India, white supremacists in Sweden, ISIS in Lebanon and Kosovo, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and others, the varied threats all had this basic underlying issue of mistrust. The rebel communities distrusted the government, and the government was equally suspicious of the rebel motivations, and neither party could get their problem solved until this fundamental issue was fixed. So what does the execution of a trust-building system look like, and what is the process to achieve such an ambitious goal? In the workshop, we sat down, and the first thing we did was discuss a list. What are the components of a plan that builds trust? And here you can see on the slide, they wanted something that was a collaborative system. Well, areas perspective-taking is inherently collaborative, a clear definition of success. I just took you through how area focuses on the outcome of the decision, how you know that it succeeded, and critical concepts. Evidence-based documentation, area takes you through that by how it helps you to collect and vet information in the steps, and then a way to share that information back that vets assumptions. An area guides you to log your information into a journal and create an audit trail of your work and your thinking. So let's go through the case study. In the windowless State Department conference room, I laid out this case study that explained how area was used to build trust in Nepal after the devastating earthquake a few years ago. Back then, John Christopher, the founder of a basic healthcare charity, wanted to move immediately after the earthquake to get to people in need. After assessing his options, he realized that the best way to do that was to scale up quickly by using available space throughout the country in government clinics. So the problem was, why was that space available? It was because the local Nepalese didn't trust the government because of their shoddy reputation for providing health care. And so ODA needed the government clinics to foster and administer the care, but it also needed to broker trust with the government and the local Nepalese to get them to accept ODA's care. So 2 issues had to be addressed. How could ODA convince a mistrustful population to get past prior negative experiences with the government clinics? And then how could ODA protect itself as an independent charity separate from and untainted by the government? So here's what he did. First, you can see the classic decision problem, which is open-ended, and how he was asked about using areas inversion. Below, you can see the critical concepts, and we were just talking about the bottom 2 critical concepts, which, as I was saying, are at odds with one another, especially since healthcare is fundamentally at the intersection of both. So John was going to have to find a way to build trust between these groups so that his organization could effectively do its work and the people could effectively get the urgent care. So the first A in area, as I mentioned, this is absolute information, primary source information from the target at the center of your decision. For John and the ODA Foundation, it was the country of Nepal. For you and your work, it could be whatever is at the center of your decision. So here are a couple of the sample steps. He began from searching from close up on his target. What kind of data did they provide? Now, not all decisions should be decided purely based on numerical data, but it's a really important idea to find out what numerical data is collected, because that gives you an idea of what the target thinks is important. John searched the Nepal website for population and healthcare information. He didn't expect to find reliable information, but again, area is fundamentally about vetting your assumptions and judgments. So he looked for data and he found some so that he could figure out, well, how many patients might potentially show up at the clinics? What was the population figures for the areas where the clinics were located? And what kind of trauma might these populations be experiencing? And were they ones that ODA could competently handle? In the relative phase, you move to the next concentric circle of information. These are sources somehow connected to the target of your decision. One of the steps that you'll do here is a literature review, and you can see that what John did here was he learned to potentially make some of his mistakes before he was going to make them. What could he learn from other organizations operating in the developing world? How did they work after disaster? What happened that when they were in a country that fundamentally had a government that had a reputation that was in question? What other kinds of services might the government be able to provide John as he was working there? And so you can see some of the organizations that he studied and some of the different groups that the information came from, including a potential donor source that tended to fund opportunities after disasters. In exploration, I mentioned that there's 2 E's that fundamentally upgrade your research beyond document-based sources. And here you can see that John used what I call my interview formula. It's at the bottom. GP plus GQ equals IQ. Identifying the right people, asking them the right questions, gives you your interview quality. And I worked with him to identify other healthcare charities, government officials, lay leaders, doctors, and so on. Exploitation then upgrades your research for you as an individual. How do you process information? Here I use a bunch of creative exercises that I learned from experts in other fields, such as the intelligence community. And one of my favorite exercises was from a declassified CIA manual. It's called the Competing Alternative Hypothesis exercise. So here John looked at his evidence against his hypotheses, and what he realized was that he really didn't nail down that population information, nor did he really figure out what kind of ailments people could be suffering from. And so this part of the process I often find is where people most aggressively activate the feedback loop. And so this drove John back into relative work in particular to nail down those population numbers, because not only might quality of care suffer, but ODA could permanently damage its reputation if it didn't fundamentally understand how many people it might be serving and whether or not it had the competency to deliver the right quality of care. In the analysis part, here you're synthesizing what you've learned from other perspectives, and even though at this point you generally know what decision you're going to make, you pause one more time to think about how could that decision fail? And so here I guided John to go through a PreMortem. It's the opposite of the postmortem that doctors use, where the joke is that everybody benefits but the patient who's passed away. And so the PreMortem work gave John not only a plan of action, but a variety of safeguards to tackle the weaknesses in his plan. For instance, he identified local lay leaders who could travel to these new communities where the new government clinics were and vouch for ODA's quality of care and for its independence. In sum, you can see the ODA audit trail. Not only did it give John a written journal of his work and thinking, showing the perspective taking and the empathy with which he used to consider the needs of other stakeholders, but he also had something that could work as a discussion document, something that wasn't tinged with emotion, something that showed that he challenged his assumptions and his biases, and could be a tangible work that could invite others to comment and understand his research and his decision. But also, and importantly, it gave him an objective measurement of success against which he could evaluate. So how did I do? Was my work well done? And could I see where I might have gone wrong? How did his decision turn out? Well, patient visits immediately jumped 62%, and over time, after people began using the government clinics, they then began using other government services. The second thing was that by using AREA, John was much more clearly able to articulate ODA's goals, as well as his process, and this led to much greater donor buy-in. As a matter of fact, within the few short weeks after we completed this plan for John, he was able to go out to current and new donors and fully cover the cost of implementing this important project. And finally, there were many other charities that weren't comfortable working in Nepal because they didn't want their reputations to suffer. And after John's organization was able to show it could be done successfully, about a half a dozen other organizations that had not worked in Nepal began operating in this area, including Save the Children, the International Foundation, Prosthetics Without Borders, and so on. Here are just a couple testimonials from the counter-terror group. You can see that the official from India said that area makes the process of exploration before any concrete action more significant and vital. I'm just going to give you one more from Uganda. You can see here that the official said, I don't have to rely on clouded judgment as it could preempt bias. Now, I contacted the official from Uganda last week in preparation for coming to this conference. So what? How has area been for you? And he mentioned that just 2 weeks ago he had conducted a workshop in the north of the country in Gulu, which is still suffering from the 26-year conflict that has been going on there and has seen a dramatic influx of refugees from Sudan. And he conducted a workshop that focused on countering violent extremism with a group of youths on problems that they're facing, and then using area to diagnose, frame, and solve problems to strengthen their community and build resilience amid widespread education problems and vast unemployment there. And what he said to me is, Cheryl, these are problems that don't get fixed by money. They're fixed by community interventions using something like area. And he said that it worked as they applied it in all different types of situations for the participants. So while this case study is about one specific example, I hope you can see that area is actually applicable to all sorts of problems, personal and professional, government-related and beyond, and that the area method is able to do so because decision makers can choose what steps they want to apply, customize, and expedite the decision-making process. With John, he knew the problem, and he even settled on a solution. But as I just took you through, it was a problematic solution, one that almost seemed destined for failure. And yet he snatched victory from the jaws of defeat because of how he went about his problem solving. So sometimes we know what the problem is, sometimes we know what the solution is, sometimes we know both, and sometimes we know neither. But the bottom line is that whether you're making a high-stakes personal or professional decision, it's important to recognize that we don't operate in a vacuum. We all make decisions within a context, and yet our perception of that context is blurred by our biases. And that's just one hurdle that we have to get over. The other hurdle is that our decisions, even our most personal ones, involve others. And by finding a way to proactively work with and work through ambiguity with these other stakeholders and confronting their incentives, you can not only build trust, but you can possibly build bridges. Thank you.